This is not a drill. This is not speculation. And this is not something that might happen tomorrow. This already happened. And if you're an American taxpayer, a small business owner, or just someone who buys groceries in this country, what I'm about to tell you for the next 30 minutes is going to make your jaw hit the floor. So do not click away, because what you're about to hear could directly affect your wallet, your job, and the future of this economy. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court did something that almost nobody saw coming. In a devastating 6-3 ruling, the highest court in the land told President Donald Trump that his sweeping global tariffs were illegal, unconstitutional, and had to stop immediately. Let me say that again so it sinks in. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the tariffs Trump spent the last year calling his greatest economic achievement were, in the eyes of the law, completely and totally unauthorized. The case Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump consolidated challenges from hundreds of small businesses, importers, and even state governments who said Trump had no legal right to use a 1977 emergency powers law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPI, to slap tariffs on virtually every product coming into this country from nearly every trading partner on the planet. And the court agreed. The majority opinion made it crystal clear that EIPA does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. Period. Full stop. End of discussion. Now, here's where it gets absolutely wild. And when Trump received the news, he was in a meeting with governors at the White House. And according to a governor who was in that room, Trump read the note, said out loud, quote, "That's a disgrace," end quote, and then walked out. Just walked out. Hours later, he held a press conference in the White House briefing room and went off. He called the ruling deeply disappointing. He said he was, quote, "ashamed of certain members of the court," end quote. And remember, 2 of the 6 justices who voted against him were Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, both of whom he personally appointed to the bench. And when a reporter asked if he regretted nominating them, Trump said their decision was terrible and called it, quote, "an embarrassment to their families," end quote. Think about that for a second. The President of the United States publicly shaming Supreme Court justices that he himself picked because they chose the Constitution over political loyalty. And it didn't stop there. Within hours of the ruling, Trump announced he was signing an executive order to impose a brand new 10% global tariff. But this time under a completely different law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on CNBC and said that 10% was going to rise to 15% sometime this week, and that by August tariff rates would effectively return to where they stood before the Supreme Court ruling. So let me break this down for you in plain English. The Supreme Court told Trump his tariffs were illegal, and his response was to immediately impose new tariffs using a different legal authority, essentially daring the courts to strike those down, too. And guess what? 24 states led by New York Attorney General Letitia James have already filed a brand new lawsuit to block these Section 122 tariffs as well, calling them an illegal end-run around the Supreme Court's decision. James said Trump is ignoring the law and the Constitution to effectively raise taxes on consumers and small businesses. And she's not wrong, because here's the part that should make every single American furious. The federal government collected over $130 billion from these illegal tariffs through December of 2025. And according to the Penn-Wharton budget model at the University of Pennsylvania, the total refund exposure could reach as high as $175 billion. That is your money. That is money that American businesses paid that got passed on to you through higher prices on everything from furniture to electronics to groceries. And now the question is whether you'll ever see a dime of it back. A federal judge named Richard Eaton, a senior judge on the U.S. Court of International Trade, ruled on March 4th that all importers of record are entitled to benefit from the Supreme Court ruling. And he ordered Customs and Border Protection to stop collecting the illegal tariffs and to begin the process of finalizing paperwork so refunds can be issued. More than 2,000 companies have now filed lawsuits seeking their money back, including massive names like Costco and FedEx, and the coalition called We Pay the Tariffs, which represents over 1,000 small businesses, called it a victory, but warned that the government might try to drag the process out. And they were right to be worried, because on the Friday after the ruling U.S. Customs and Border Protection said they're preparing an electronic system for refunds, but that it won't be ready for 45 days. And even then, they said they can't automatically dispense refunds without importers formally requesting them. Trump himself stood at that podium and said the refund fight could be in court for up to 5 years. And when asked directly if he planned to honor the refunds, he just looked at the reporters and said, "I just told you the answer right." Which tells you everything you need to know about how this administration views your money. Now, if you're finding this information valuable, if this is the kind of real in-depth breakdown you've been looking for, do me a huge favor right now. Smash that subscribe button. Hit the bell notification so you never miss a video like this, because the mainstream media is not covering this story with the depth it deserves. And I promise you, we are going to keep digging into every single development as it unfolds. Now, let me take you north of the border for a moment, because what's happening in Canada right now is a masterclass in how to respond to economic warfare. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in 2025, has been playing the long game against Trump's tariffs since day one. And the Supreme Court ruling has completely vindicated his strategy. While Trump was using tariffs as a blunt weapon, Carney was quietly rebuilding Canada's entire economic infrastructure. He launched a $5 billion strategic response fund for businesses hit by tariffs. He implemented a nationwide Buy Canadian procurement policy requiring the federal government to prioritize Canadian suppliers. He expanded business loans for small and medium enterprises. He signed a historic new trade partnership with China that includes reduced tariffs on Canadian canola, lobster, crab, and peas, opening up a market of 1.4 billion people, and he rolled out billions in support for Canada's steel, lumber, and auto sectors. Carney told the Canadian people that the decadal-long process of ever closer economic relationship with the U.S. is over, and that Canada's strengths of being tied to America are now vulnerabilities. He committed to doubling Canada's non-U.S. exports over the next decade. And here's the kicker that ties directly back to our story. While the U.S. government is now potentially on the hook for $175 billion in refunds, that it doesn't have sitting in a room somewhere ready to cut checks. As one trade attorney put it, Canada under Carney has been collecting retaliatory tariff revenue, diversifying its trade partnerships, and positioning itself to come out of this trade war stronger than it went in. The contrast could not be more stark. One leader is having his signature economic policy demolished by his own Supreme Court while scrambling to find new legal authority to keep the tariffs going. And the other is calmly building an economic fortress that doesn't depend on a single trading partner. And speaking of the economic impact on everyday Americans, let me give you the numbers that the cable news networks keep glossing over. Before the Supreme Court ruling, the average American household was paying roughly $400 more per year because of Trump's tariffs. That's according to multiple independent economic analyses. The tariffs didn't make foreign companies pay. American importers paid the duties, and then they passed those costs directly onto you, the consumer. Your furniture cost more, your electronics cost more, your groceries cost more. Small businesses were getting crushed because they couldn't absorb the added costs. And many had to choose between raising prices on their customers or going out of business. Senator Elizabeth Warren posted on social media that Trump essentially stole money from Americans with his illegal tariffs, and that it's time for him to pay up and give the money back. Illinois' Governor J.B. Pritzker sent Trump a letter invoicing him for $8.7 billion, which works out to about $1.700 for every family in Illinois. Former Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown called for a $13.36 refund for every Ohio household. Democrats in the Senate have introduced legislation that would require full refunds with interest on all the money collected under the illegal e-tariffs. And some Democrats are trying to make direct consumer refunds a central issue heading into the 2026 midterm elections. And honestly, can you blame them? Because look at the polling. A Washington Post and ABC News survey conducted just before the Supreme Court ruling found that 64% of Americans disapproved of how Trump was handling tariffs. And after the ruling, a SNEP YouGov poll found that 60% of Americans strongly approved of the court striking them down. That's not a partisan issue. And that is a broad bipartisan consensus that these tariffs were hurting real people. Now, here's what really keeps me up at night. And it should keep you up, too. Trump is not giving up. He never gives up on tariffs. That much is abundantly clear. The new Section 122 tariffs he imposed have a built-in limit of 150 days unless Congress approves an extension. And Congress has shown absolutely zero appetite for doing that, especially with midterm elections looming. But Treasury Secretary Bessent has already laid out the playbook. He said the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and the Commerce Department will use those 150 days to complete trade studies that would allow them to impose tariffs under other authorities like Section 301, which deals with unfair trade practices, and Section 232, which covers national security tariffs. The Chatham House analysis put it perfectly. It is a fallacy to assume that Trump will play by the rules. His past behavior suggests that if these alternative authorities don't give him the broad tariff power he wants, he may simply extend the 122 tariffs or use 301 and 232 in unprecedented and arguably illegal ways, essentially challenging importers to sue him again. We could be looking at a cycle of tariffs, lawsuits, Supreme Court rulings, new tariffs, and more lawsuits that goes on for the rest of this presidency. And here's a detail that most people are missing entirely. The Supreme Court ruling doesn't cover all of Trump's tariffs. It specifically struck down the ones imposed under IEEPA, which included the so-called reciprocal tariffs affecting nearly every trading partner, and the drug trafficking tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. But there are other tariffs still in effect. The de minimis exemption, which used to allow packages under $800 to enter the country duty-free, was suspended by Trump last summer, and the Supreme Court was silent on whether its ruling applied to that. So, if you're ordering products from overseas through sites like Shein or Temu, you're still paying full tariffs on items under $800. There are also pre-existing tariffs under Section 232 on steel and aluminum and Section 301 tariffs on Chinese goods that were first imposed during Trump's first term and expanded during his second. Those are all still in effect. The trade landscape right now is an absolute mess, and the only people who are winning are the trade attorneys who are billing by the hour to sort all of this out. Now, let me address something that I know a lot of you are thinking. Does this ruling actually matter if Trump is just going to keep finding new ways to impose tariffs? And the answer is yes, absolutely. It matters enormously. For the first time, the Supreme Court has drawn a clear constitutional line that says Congress holds the power of the purse. Congress controls trade policy, and the president cannot unilaterally impose tariffs on the entire world by declaring an emergency. That is a foundational principle of our system of government, and it was reaffirmed by a 6-3 majority that included justices from across the ideological spectrum. Justice Gorsuch wrote a concurring opinion specifically invoking the major questions doctrine, saying that such an extraordinary power cannot be hidden in the ambiguous text of a decades-old emergency law. Even Justice Kagan and Justice Jackson, who aren't exactly known for agreeing with Gorsuch on much, joined the majority. This ruling will constrain not just this president, but every future president who might try to use emergency powers as a backdoor to trade policy. And for the global economy, this matters too. Countries that sign trade deals with the Trump administration are now scrambling to figure out what happens to those agreements now that the legal basis for the tariffs has been pulled out from under them. The European Union has halted ratification of its trade deal with the US, saying it needs full clarity on what comes next. India is reassessing its deal. The whole international trading system is in a state of uncertainty that we haven't seen in decades, and that uncertainty costs real money, real jobs, and real economic growth. Before I get into the final stretch of this, I want to say one more time, if you've made it this far in this video, you are the kind of viewer who cares about what's really going on in this country, and I deeply appreciate that. Please take 2 seconds right now to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this, and drop a comment below telling me what you think. Should the government issue full refunds to every American household, or is this going to get buried in the courts for years? I read every single comment, and I want to hear from you. Now, let me bring this home with what I think is the most important takeaway from this entire story. We are living through one of the most consequential moments in American economic history, and most people don't even realize it. A sitting president had the centerpiece of his economic agenda ruled illegal by the Supreme Court, was told he owes up to $175 billion in refunds. And his response was to publicly attack the justices he appointed, announced new tariffs under a different law within hours, and tell the American people that any refunds could take 5 years of litigation. Meanwhile, the federal government's finances are already strained. Where is this $175 billion going to come from? One attorney who was interviewed by NBC News put it bluntly, "It's not like there's over $100 billion sitting in a room somewhere to just cut checks. This is a Treasury problem. Some economists believe the Treasury may need to borrow additional money just to cover the refund obligations, which would add to the national debt. Others think the administration is reimposing tariffs under new authorities, partly to generate revenue to offset the refund costs, which means American businesses and consumers would essentially be paying twice, once through the illegal tariffs and again through the replacement tariffs that are supposed to fund the refunds for the illegal ones." If that sounds insane, that's because it is. This is what happens when economic policy is driven by executive whim rather than congressional deliberation. When tariffs are treated as a tool of political theater rather than carefully calibrated trade policy, and when the checks and balances of our constitutional system have to be invoked by small business owners and state attorneys general just to enforce the basic principle that the president is not a king. The Supreme Court reminded us of that principle on February 20th. And no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, that should give you some comfort. The system, for all its flaws, still works, but the fight is far from over. New tariffs are already in effect. New lawsuits are already being filed. The refund process is going to be long and messy, and the midterm elections are going to turn this into the biggest economic issue on the ballot. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep coming back to this channel because I am going to be covering every single development in this story as it happens. That's all for today. I'm going to leave a link in the description to the full Supreme Court opinion if you want to read it for yourself. And I'll also link to the Penn-Wharton analysis that breaks down exactly where the $175 billion figure comes from. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. And I'll see you in the next